In the early morning darkness of September 1st, 1997, as London slept, unaware that the world had forever changed, a single white rose lay forgotten on the cold pavement outside Kensington Palace. Within hours, that lone flower would become the first drop in an ocean of grief that would wash over not just Britain, but the entire world. This is the untold story of how one man, sworn to protect the royal family in life, found himself guarding their memory in death, and witnessed firsthand how a simple gesture of love sparked the greatest public mourning in modern history. What you're about to discover isn't just another retelling of Princess Diana's tragic end. It's the raw, intimate account of Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell, a man who stood silent sentinel for over a decade, watching as the people's princess transformed from shy kindergarten teacher to global icon and finally to eternal symbol of compassion. Through his eyes, you'll experience the shock, the disbelief, and the unprecedented outpouring of love that followed her death. A love so powerful it literally brought a nation to its knees. Prepare yourself for a journey that will take you behind the palace walls, into the heart of grief-stricken Britain, and ultimately to the profound realization that sometimes it takes losing someone extraordinary to understand just how much they meant to us all. Thomas Mitchell had always prided himself on being unshakable. After 12 years as a royal guard at Kensington Palace, he had seen everything the royal family could throw at him. State dinners that went wrong, paparazzi climbing walls, even the occasional protester who somehow made it past the first line of security. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the phone call that shattered his world at 3:47 a.m. on August 31st, 1997. The piercing ring of his bedside telephone cut through the peaceful silence of his small flat in West London. Thomas reached for it instinctively, his military training kicking in even through the fog of sleep. Calls at this hour meant only one thing: emergency. As the duty officer's voice crackled through the receiver, each word felt like a physical blow. "Thomas, you need to get to the palace immediately. There's been an accident in Paris. The princess, she's gone." The words didn't make sense at first. Gone where? Diana had left for Paris just days earlier with Dodi Fayed, looking happier than Thomas had seen her in months. He had watched her car pull away from Kensington Palace, noting how she had turned back one last time to wave at the building that had been both her sanctuary and her prison for 16 years. "What do you mean, gone?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Car crash in a tunnel. Diana, Dottie, and Henry Paul. Only the bodyguard survived." The line went quiet for a moment. "Thomas, the media is going to descend on us like a hurricane. We need all hands on deck." Thomas set the phone down with trembling fingers. Princess Diana was dead. The woman he had watched grow from a nervous 19-year-old bride into the most photographed woman in the world was gone. The mother who had revolutionized royal parenting by taking her boys to McDonald's and theme parks, who had held AIDS patients when the world still feared to touch them, who had walked through minefields to bring attention to forgotten causes, she was gone. He sat on the edge of his bed for several minutes, trying to process what he had been told. In his mind, he could still see her from just last week, kneeling in the palace gardens, showing Prince Harry how to properly plant roses. Her laugh had echoed off the palace walls as Harry got more soil on his clothes than in the flower bed. "The flowers need love to grow, Harry," she had said, her voice carrying that gentle authority that made everyone listen. Just like people do. The drive to Kensington Palace took place in a blur of empty London streets and flickering streetlights. As Thomas approached the familiar iron gates, he expected to see the usual scene: a few early morning joggers, perhaps a tourist or two taking pictures. Instead, he found something that would haunt him forever. A lone woman stood at the palace gates, clutching a single white rose. She was crying silently, her shoulders shaking with each sob. Even in the dim streetlight, Thomas could see the tears streaming down her face. As he parked his car and walked toward the security booth, he heard her whisper, "Thank you, Diana. Thank you for everything." She placed the white rose against the iron gates and walked away, disappearing into the London dawn. Thomas stood there staring at that single flower and somehow knew that everything was about to change. By 6 a.m., word had spread through London's underground network of early commuters, radio listeners, and insomniacs scrolling through early internet news sites. Thomas watched from his post as people began to arrive at the palace gates, each carrying flowers, cards, photographs, and teddy bears. They came in ones and twos at first, then in small groups, then in crowds that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Eleanor Hughes, an elderly woman who lived near the palace, and whom Thomas recognized from her daily walks, was among the first. She carried a bouquet of pink roses, Diana's favorite color, and a handwritten note. When she saw Thomas, she approached him with tears in her eyes. "She was our princess, Mrs. Danzani," Hughes said simply. "She understood what it meant to suffer. She made us feel less alone." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as Mrs. Hughes carefully placed her flowers next to the white rose that had started it all. As she walked away, she turned back and added, "She would have wanted us to remember the good she did. That's how we'll keep her alive." The morning shift change brought more guards to the palace, but also brought something none of them had anticipated: crowds that stretched as far as the eye could see. By 8 a.m., Kensington Palace Gardens looked like nothing Thomas had ever witnessed. The area around the gates was carpeted with flowers of every color and description: roses, lilies, carnations, wildflowers picked from London parks, elaborate arrangements from florists, and simple daisies clutched in the hands of children who had convinced their parents to bring them. But it wasn't just the flowers that moved Thomas, it was the people. He watched a businessman in an expensive suit kneel beside a homeless man, both of them crying as they placed their tributes side by side. A group of teenagers who looked like they had been out all night sat on the grass, holding each other and sharing stories about how Diana had inspired them. An elderly Indian man in traditional dress stood next to a young punk rocker with bright purple hair, both united in their grief. Thomas had been trained to observe everything, to notice potential threats and unusual behavior, but what he observed that morning defied all his training. There was no disorder, no pushing, no arguments over space. Instead, there was a reverence he had only seen in cathedrals. People spoke in hushed tones, sharing memories of Diana's visits to their hospitals, schools, and community centers. They told stories of how her mere presence had changed their lives, how her willingness to break royal protocol had made them feel seen and valued. A young mother with two small children caught Thomas's attention. The children, a boy and a girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, each carried small bunches of flowers. The mother was explaining to them why they were there, her voice patient, despite her obvious grief. "Princess Diana loved children like you," she told them. "She worked very hard to make sure all children in the world could be safe and happy. That's why we're bringing her flowers, to say thank you." The little girl, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, looked up at her mother seriously. "Will the princess see our flowers in heaven, Mummy?" "I think she will, sweetheart. I think she'll see every single flower, and she'll know how much people loved her." As Thomas listened to this exchange, he realized that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't just mourning, it was a celebration of everything Diana had represented. The flowers weren't just tributes to her death, but acknowledgments of how she had lived. Each rose, each lily, each carefully written card represented a life she had touched, a cause she had championed, a moment when she had chosen compassion over protocol. The palace staff worked frantically to manage the crowds, but Thomas noticed that they too were affected. Palace guards who had served for decades, who had seen state funerals and royal weddings, walked among the flowers with expressions of wonder. Even the most senior staff members who had initially worried about security and logistics soon found themselves moved by the genuine outpouring of love. By noon, television crews from around the world had arrived, but they seemed almost secondary to what was happening. The story was telling itself through the actions of ordinary people who had loved an extraordinary woman. Thomas watched as reporters tried to capture the magnitude of what they were witnessing, but cameras couldn't convey the feeling in the air, the sense that the world had lost someone truly irreplaceable. As his shift continued, Thomas found himself thinking about the years he had watched Diana transform from a shy teenager into the woman the world called the People's Princess. He remembered her first day at Kensington Palace after the wedding, how she had insisted on learning the names of every staff member. She had a gift for making people feel important, whether they were heads of state or cleaning ladies. He recalled the day she had found him sitting alone during his break, looking at a letter from home about his mother's illness. Without being asked, Diana had sat beside him and simply said, "Sometimes life is harder than we expect it to be." She hadn't offered empty platitudes or royal solutions. She had just acknowledged his pain, and somehow that had been enough. That was Diana's genius, Thomas realized as he watched the crowds grow throughout the day. She didn't pretend that life was easy or that royal privilege could solve everything. Instead, she acknowledged that life was difficult, that people suffered, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply show up and care. The single white rose that had started the day was now buried beneath millions of flowers, but Thomas never forgot it. As evening approached and the crowds showed no signs of diminishing, he understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something unprecedented. This wasn't just about mourning a princess. It was about mourning the loss of hope itself. Diana had represented the possibility that power could be used for good, that privilege could be a force for positive change, and that royalty could have a human face. As the sun set over London, casting long shadows across the ocean of flowers, Thomas prepared for what he knew would be the most challenging week of his career. But he also felt something else. Pride. Pride in the people he served, pride in the woman whose memory he was protecting, and pride in being part of something that proved beyond any doubt that love was indeed more powerful than protocol. The white rose was gone, lost among millions of other tributes, but its impact would be felt around the world. Tomorrow would bring even larger crowds, more flowers, and more tears. But tonight, as Thomas walked among the tributes in the quiet evening air, he whispered a promise to the princess who could no longer hear him. "We'll keep your memory alive, Your Royal Highness. Every flower, every tear, every story, they'll all be part of your legacy." The silence before the storm was over. Now came the deluge of love that would reshape how the world remembered Princess Diana forever. September 1st, 1997, dawned gray and drizzly as if London itself was weeping. Thomas Mitchell arrived at Kensington Palace before sunrise, but even in the pre-dawn darkness he could hear them. Thousands of voices creating a low hum of conversation, prayer, and quiet sobbing. What he saw when he rounded the corner to the palace gates defied all comprehension. The ocean of flowers that had started with a single white rose now stretched for acres. Bouquets were piled 6 feet high against the palace railings, spilling onto the sidewalks across the street and into Hyde Park itself. The sweet fragrance of millions of blooms mixed with the morning mist created an almost otherworldly atmosphere. But it wasn't just flowers anymore. Photographs of Diana smiled from every surface, some professional portraits, others candid shots captured by lucky tourists. Handwritten letters in dozens of languages fluttered in the breeze, attached to railings, tucked between flower stems, and weighted down with small stones. Thomas had been a royal guard long enough to know how to read crowds, how to spot trouble before it started. But this crowd was unlike anything in his training manuals. He estimated at least 50,000 people had gathered overnight, and more were arriving every minute. Buses, trains, and cars from across Britain disgorged mourners who clutched flowers, teddy bears, and photographs. International flights were landing at Heathrow, with passengers whose sole purpose was to pay their respects to a woman they had never met but had loved from afar. What struck Thomas most was the diversity of the crowd. He saw coal miners from Wales standing next to tech entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley who had flown in overnight. Elderly women who remembered the war shared space with teenagers who had grown up watching Diana's every move in tabloid magazines. Muslim families knelt beside Catholic nuns, both groups praying for the soul of a woman who had bridge-built between faiths and cultures throughout her life. The logistics alone were staggering. The palace staff, working with London Metropolitan Police, had set up emergency coordination centers to manage the crowds. Food vendors appeared as if from nowhere, but most refused payment, instead offering free tea and sandwiches to mourners who had traveled hundreds of miles. Local residents opened their homes to provide restroom facilities and shelter from the intermittent rain. By mid-morning, Thomas received word that similar scenes were playing out at Buckingham Palace, St. Paul's Cathedral, and Westminster Abbey. Every royal residence, every place Diana had visited regularly, every location connected to her memory was experiencing unprecedented gatherings. But Kensington Palace remained the epicenter, the place where Diana had lived, where she had raised her sons, where she had found whatever peace was possible in her tumultuous life. As Thomas walked his rounds, he began collecting stories from the mourners, partly as a security measure but increasingly out of genuine fascination with what he was witnessing. Each story revealed another facet of Diana's impact on ordinary lives. Sarah Williams, a nurse from Manchester, had driven through the night with her 3 colleagues. "She visited our ward in 1995, Sarah explained, her voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "We had this little boy, Jamie, who was dying of leukemia. Diana spent 2 hours with him, just talking and laughing. She didn't bring cameras or press. She just came because she heard about him. Jamie died 3 months later, but he never stopped talking about his princess. His mother is here somewhere. She comes every year to remember." Dr. Michael Harrison, who ran an HIV clinic in Birmingham, had a different story. The prejudice against AIDS patients in the early 90s was unbelievable. He told Thomas while carefully placing a red ribbon among the flowers. "People wouldn't touch them, wouldn't sit near them. Then Diana walked into my clinic, no gloves, no protection, and shook hands with everyone. She hugged patients that their own families had abandoned. The photograph of her holding that man's hand went around the world. It changed everything. Overnight, people stopped being so afraid. But it wasn't just the major charitable work that people remembered. Margaret Thompson, an elderly woman from Scotland, had brought a small posy of heather. I met her at a village fete in 1988, Margaret recounted. I was running the jam stall, nothing fancy. She spent 20 minutes talking to me about my recipe for strawberry preserves. 20 minutes, with me, a nobody from nowhere. She asked for the recipe and said she wanted to try making it with her boys. Made me feel like the most important person in the world. These personal encounters, Thomas realized, were being multiplied by thousands. Every person in the crowd seemed to have a story, either of meeting Diana personally or of being inspired by her actions. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who had revolutionized what it meant to be royal, not through grand gestures alone, but through countless small acts of human connection. The international response was equally overwhelming. Thomas watched as tour buses arrived from France, Germany, Italy, and beyond. Flight manifests later revealed that people had traveled from as far as Japan, Australia, and Brazil specifically to join the mourning in London. The American media had descended in force, with networks providing round-the-clock coverage that was reaching global audiences in the hundreds of millions. Foreign diplomats began arriving at the palace, not for official business, but as private citizens paying their respect. Thomas personally witnessed the ambassador from Botswana, tears streaming down his face, explaining to a BBC reporter how Diana's visit to his country had brought international attention to the AIDS crisis there. She could have visited anywhere, he said. She chose to come to us, to the forgotten people. She held babies that others feared to touch. She was not just England's princess. She belonged to the world. By afternoon, the crowd management situation was becoming critical. London's transport system was buckling under the strain of people trying to reach Kensington Palace. The Underground had added extra trains, but platforms were still dangerously overcrowded. Traffic had ground to a complete halt in a 5-mile radius around the palace. Heathrow Airport reported that international arrivals were running 4 hours behind schedule as immigration officers processed thousands of visitors whose stated reason for entry was simply to pay respects to Diana. Thomas found himself working 18-hour shifts, but the exhaustion was offset by the privilege of witnessing history unfold. He began to understand that what he was seeing wasn't just grief, it was a collective awakening. Diana's death had forced people to confront what they had lost, not just in terms of an individual, but in terms of hope for a more compassionate world. The flowers themselves had become a phenomenon worthy of study. Botanists later estimated that over 10 million individual blooms were left at Diana tribute sites across London during the first week after her death. The variety was staggering. Formal arrangements from the world's most exclusive florists shared space with wildflowers picked from roadside verges by children. Roses predominated, but every species imaginable was represented. Sunflowers from Van Gogh fans, lilies from those who remembered her funeral appearance, white flowers from those who emphasized her purity, red roses from those who celebrated her passion. Local florists had sold out their entire stock within hours of Diana's death being announced. Garden centers across Britain reported unprecedented demand for flowers, with people stripping their own gardens to contribute to the tribute. Supermarkets that had never stocked fresh flowers found themselves setting up emergency floral departments. International flower markets in Holland worked around the clock to meet the demand, with cargo planes carrying millions of roses, tulips, and carnations to London. But the flowers were just the beginning. As Thomas continued his rounds, he discovered teddy bears by the thousands, many holding handwritten notes. Children's artwork covered every available surface, with drawings of Diana surrounded by hearts, rainbows, and flowers. Photographs of Diana with her sons were particularly popular, often accompanied by messages for William and Harry expressing sympathy and support. The letters were perhaps the most moving aspect of the tribute. Written in dozens of languages, they came from heads of state and homeless individuals alike. Thomas noticed palace staff carefully collecting and cataloging every piece of correspondence, understanding instinctively that these represented a historical record of unprecedented value. Many letters were from people sharing their own stories of loss, finding in Diana's death a way to process their own grief. One letter that particularly moved Thomas was from a young mother in Northern Ireland. Dear Princess Diana, my son was killed in the Troubles 3 years ago. When I saw you hug those children in Belfast, when I saw you refuse to take sides, I felt hope for the first time since his death. You showed us that love is stronger than hate. Thank you for teaching us how to heal. Religious leaders from across the spectrum began arriving at the palace, not for formal ceremonies, but to offer comfort to mourners and to pay their own respects. Thomas witnessed an extraordinary scene as the Archbishop of Canterbury knelt in prayer beside an Islamic imam, both men united in their appreciation for Diana's interfaith work. Hindu priests, Buddhist monks, Jewish rabbis, and Christian ministers of every denomination found common ground in honoring a woman who had transcended religious boundaries. The media coverage was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Television networks abandoned regular programming to provide continuous coverage of the mourning scenes. CNN, BBC, Sky News, and networks from around the globe set up permanent installations around the palace. But even the most experienced journalists seemed overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. Thomas overheard veteran war correspondent James Mitchell, no relation despite the shared surname, tell his cameraman, "I've covered conflicts, natural disasters, political upheavals, but I've never seen anything like this. This isn't just news. This is a fundamental shift in human consciousness. She's showing us what we're capable of when we choose love over indifference." Technology was struggling to keep up with the global demand for information. Early internet servers crashed under the load of millions of people seeking updates. International phone lines were overwhelmed as people called friends and family to share their grief. Photography stores reported running out of film as people documented their participation in the tribute. As evening approached on September 1st, Thomas realized that the single white rose that had started everything had been transformed into something beyond imagination. What had begun as one person's quiet tribute had become a global phenomenon that was redefining how the world expressed grief, love, and hope. The crowd showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the numbers were growing as international flights continued to arrive and as people across Britain finished work and made pilgrimages to London. Thomas prepared for another long night, knowing that tomorrow would bring even larger crowds as the world prepared for Diana's funeral. Standing among the flowers as darkness fell, Thomas reflected on the woman whose life and death had created this unprecedented outpouring. Diana had always said she wanted to be the people's princess, to use her position to serve others rather than to be served. As he looked out over the sea of love stretching to the horizon, he realized she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. The single flower had indeed sparked the world's tribute, but what Thomas understood now was that it had also sparked something deeper, a recognition of our shared humanity and our collective capacity for love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crowds, and new expressions of grief. But tonight, as London held vigil for its fallen princess, the world had stopped to remember what truly mattered. Saturday, September 6, 1997, the day of Princess Diana's funeral, began before dawn for Thomas Mitchell. As he made his way through the empty London streets at 4 a.m., the silence felt unnatural, almost sacred. For the first time in a week, the crowds had temporarily dispersed, but their presence lingered in the carpet of flowers that now covered several city blocks, and in the lingering fragrance of millions of blooms that had transformed central London into the world's largest memorial garden. The logistics of managing Diana's funeral were staggering beyond anything the royal family had ever attempted. Thomas had been briefed on security arrangements that involved over 10,000 police officers, military personnel from across the Commonwealth, and diplomatic security teams from nearly every nation on Earth. But what really overwhelmed him was the human element. An estimated 3 billion people worldwide were expected to watch the funeral, with over 2 million planning to line the funeral route through London. The royal family had initially planned a private funeral, a quiet affair befitting their traditional approach to grief. But the unprecedented outpouring of public emotion had forced a complete revision of those plans. Queen Elizabeth II, who had remained at Balmoral Castle in Scotland during the initial days of mourning, had finally been persuaded to return to London and to allow what would become the most watched funeral in human history. Thomas's assignment was to oversee security at Kensington Palace during the ceremony, ensuring that the millions of flowers and tributes remained safe while the formal proceedings took place at Westminster Abbey. But as the morning progressed, he found himself witnessing something that no security manual could have prepared him for. A nation, and indeed a world, united in a way that seemed almost impossible in the modern age. By 6 a.m., people were arriving to claim positions along the funeral route, despite the ceremony not beginning until 11 a.m. These weren't just British citizens. Thomas noticed license plates from across Europe, heard conversations in dozens of languages, and watched as families who had clearly traveled vast distances unpacked folding chairs and thermoses of tea. Many had brought flowers to add to the existing displays, but others simply came to be present, to participate in what everyone seemed to understand was a moment of historical significance. The diversity of the crowd continued to amaze Thomas. He observed members of Parliament standing next to asylum seekers, investment bankers sharing space with single mothers, retired teachers chatting with international students. The normal barriers of class, race, nationality, and economic status seemed to have dissolved. Everyone was simply a human being mourning the loss of someone who had represented the best of humanity. As the morning progressed, television crews from around the world documented not just the formal proceedings, but the extraordinary scenes of public grief. Thomas watched as reporters struggled to find adequate words for what they were witnessing. The BBC's veteran correspondent, Sir David Dimbleby, later described it as the day Britain showed its heart to the world. But even that seemed insufficient to capture the magnitude of the emotional response. The flowers had continued to arrive throughout the night. Thomas personally supervised teams of volunteers who were carefully cataloging and preserving some of the tributes while making room for new arrivals. Among the new additions, he noticed flowers from the gardens of Buckingham Palace itself, a gesture that palace insiders later confirmed came from the Queen's personal instruction, a recognition that even royal protocol must bend before such overwhelming public sentiment. Children were everywhere, many too young to fully understand death but old enough to sense that something momentous was happening. Thomas watched a young girl, perhaps 6 years old, carefully place a single daisy among the elaborate arrangements. When her mother asked why she chose that particular flower, the child replied, "Princesses should have simple flowers too, Mummy, just like us." That simple statement captured something profound that Thomas had been sensing all week. Diana's appeal had always been her ability to bridge the gap between royalty and ordinary life. She had shown that power and privilege could be used to serve others, that formal titles need not create emotional distance, that being royal could mean being more human, not less. The funeral procession began at 9:08 a.m., when Diana's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with white lilies, white roses, and a card reading "Mummy" from Prince William, left Kensington Palace for the final time. Thomas watched from his security position as millions of people fell silent simultaneously. The only sounds were the clip-clop of horses' hooves, the soft rolling of carriage wheels, and the collective intake of breath from crowds that stretched as far as the eye could see. What happened next defied every protocol in the royal family's centuries-old playbook. As the funeral cortege passed through the crowds, people began throwing flowers onto the road. Not aggressively or disrespectfully, but gently, creating a carpet of petals that the horses and carriages would travel over. Within minutes, the entire funeral route was covered in flowers thrown by mourners who wanted their final gift to Diana to literally support her journey to Westminster Abbey. Thomas had witnessed many royal events, but nothing had prepared him for the sound of that morning. 2 million people, standing in complete silence, united in grief. When the procession passed certain landmarks, the palace where Diana had lived, the restaurants where she had taken her sons for normal family meals, the hospitals where she had comforted patients, the silence deepened, becoming almost physically tangible. The television coverage was capturing not just the official ceremony, but the human drama unfolding in the streets. Cameras showed businessmen in expensive suits weeping openly, punk rockers with green hair holding hands with elderly pensioners, tourists from distant countries who had never met Diana but felt compelled to participate in the global mourning. The images were being broadcast live to audiences across 6 continents, creating a shared experience that was arguably the first truly global moment of the internet age. Inside Westminster Abbey, the ceremony itself was breaking precedent in multiple ways. Elton John performed Candle in the Wind, rewritten specifically for Diana, marking the first time a contemporary song had been performed at a royal funeral. Earl Spencer's eulogy explicitly criticized the royal family's treatment of Diana and pledged to protect William and Harry from the same fate that had befallen their mother. The speech was broadcast live to the crowds outside, who responded with spontaneous applause that could be heard inside the Abbey, another unprecedented breach of royal funeral protocol. But Thomas's attention remained focused on the people outside. As the ceremony progressed, he noticed something remarkable happening among the crowds at Kensington Palace. People were not just watching the funeral on the large screens that had been erected. They were actively participating in their own acts of remembrance. Small groups formed spontaneously to share stories about Diana, to read aloud from the letters that covered every surface, to sing hymns that were being performed inside Westminster Abbey. A group of nurses from various London hospitals had gathered near the main flower display, sharing memories of Diana's hospital visits. "She never came for the cameras," one nurse explained to a gathering crowd. "She came early, stayed late, and always asked about our families as much as we asked about hers. She treated us like friends, not servants." Another group, composed of representatives from various charities Diana had supported, was reading aloud from thank you letters they had received from people around the world. A representative from the Red Cross shared correspondence from landmine survivors in Angola who had met Diana just months before her death. A spokesperson for AIDS charities read letters from patients' families who credited Diana with changing global attitudes toward their disease. The international response continued to overwhelm all expectations. Thomas received reports throughout the day of similar scenes playing out in major cities worldwide. In Paris, crowds had gathered at the Pont de l'Alma tunnel where Diana had died, leaving flowers and candles. In New York, Central Park had become an impromptu memorial site. In Calcutta, Mother Teresa's organization had created a special memorial, linking Diana with the recently deceased Nobel laureate, emphasizing their shared commitment to helping the world's most vulnerable people. Technology was struggling to cope with the global demand for real-time information. Internet servers crashed repeatedly as hundreds of millions of people sought to watch live coverage online. International phone systems were overwhelmed as people called friends and family to share their experience of the funeral. Photography stores reported their busiest day in history as people documented their participation in the event. As the funeral procession made its way from Westminster Abbey to the Spencer family estate at Althorpe, Thomas prepared for the final phase of his assignment. The crowds at Kensington Palace were not dispersing. Instead, they were settling in for what appeared to be an extended period of reflection. Many people had brought camping chairs and picnic baskets, clearly intending to spend the entire day among the flowers and tributes. The afternoon brought a different energy to the gathering. The formal ceremony was complete, but the public mourning was far from over. Thomas observed families reading to their children from the countless books that had been left among the tributes. Fairy tales, poetry, religious texts from various traditions, and children's books that Diana had been known to enjoy with William and Harry. Musical performances began spontaneously throughout the crowd. Someone had brought a guitar and was leading small groups in singing hymns and popular songs that Diana had been known to enjoy. A children's choir from a local school performed songs they had prepared for Diana's birthday, which would have occurred the following month. The atmosphere was simultaneously mournful and celebratory, grief-stricken and hopeful. As evening approached, Thomas realized he was witnessing the conclusion of something unprecedented in human history. The single white rose that had started the global tribute had spawned not just the largest gathering of flowers ever assembled, but also the largest simultaneous expression of human compassion. Conservative estimates suggested that over 60 million flowers had been left at Diana tribute sites across Britain alone, with millions more deposited at British embassies, royal residences, and memorial sites worldwide. But the flowers were just the visible symbol of something much deeper. Thomas had spent the week watching people from every background unite around shared values of compassion, service, and human dignity. He had seen a global community emerge around the principles that Diana had embodied, that privilege should be used to serve others, that power should be exercised with humility, and that love truly was more powerful than protocol. As the sun set over London on September 6, 1997, Thomas conducted his final security rounds through the ocean of flowers. The crowds were beginning to thin, but many people remained, reluctant to leave what had become hallowed ground. He overheard countless conversations in which people were making commitments to volunteer for charities Diana had supported, to be kinder to strangers, to use their own privileges, however small, to help others. A young woman approached Thomas as he walked his rounds. She was holding a wilted rose, clearly one of the original flowers from the early days of the tribute. "I've been here since Sunday," she told him. "I couldn't leave. I felt like if I left, I might forget how this feels, this sense that we're all connected, that we all matter to each other." Thomas understood exactly what she meant. The week of mourning had revealed something profound about human nature, that beneath all the divisions of nationality, class, race, and religion, there existed a fundamental capacity for shared love and mutual care. Diana's death had been a tragedy, but the response to her death had been a revelation. As he prepared to leave Kensington Palace for the final time in his role as Diana's guardian, Thomas whispered a promise to the princess, who could no longer hear him, but whose legacy would echo through generations. "Your work isn't finished, Your Royal Highness. We'll carry it forward. Every flower, every tear, every act of kindness inspired by your memory, they'll all be part of changing the world, one heart at a time." The day that changed Britain forever was ending, but its impact would resonate across the globe for decades to come. The single flower had indeed sparked the world's tribute, but more importantly, it had sparked a global awakening to the transformative power of love, compassion, and human connection. 25 years have passed since that single white rose was placed against the iron gates of Kensington Palace, but Thomas Mitchell, now retired from royal service, can still smell the fragrance of those 10 million flowers whenever he visits the Diana Memorial Garden. On this gray morning in September 2022, he stands where the original flower carpet once lay, watching a new generation of visitors discover Diana's legacy through carefully preserved exhibits and living memorials that have grown from the seeds of grief planted in 1997. The transformation has been remarkable. Where once an ocean of temporary tributes covered every surface, now stands one of London's most visited memorial spaces. The Diana Memorial Playground, built with funds donated from around the world during that extraordinary week of mourning, echoes daily with the laughter of children from every background imaginable. The playground's design incorporates elements from the original flower displays, rose gardens, lily ponds, and meadow areas filled with wildflowers that visitors still leave in remembrance. Thomas walks slowly through the memorial space, remembering specific moments from that week that changed the world. Here, where a group of nurses once shared stories about Diana's hospital visits, now stands a healing garden used by grief counselors and therapists working with traumatized children. There, where foreign diplomats wept among the flowers, sits a small amphitheater where interfaith services continue Diana's work of building bridges between communities. The numbers from that week in 1997 still stagger historians. Conservative estimates suggest that over 2.5 billion people watched Diana's funeral, nearly half of the world's population at the time. The economic impact of the mourning period reached into billions of pounds, as businesses closed, transportation systems reorganized, and entire industries refocused to accommodate the global outpouring. But what truly matters, Thomas believes, is the human impact. The way that week revealed humanity's capacity for collective compassion. Sarah Williams, the nurse from Manchester who had driven through the night in 1997, now runs a charity inspired by Diana's approach to patient care. That week showed us something we had forgotten, she explains to Thomas during one of her regular visits to the memorial. We learned that grief shared is grief diminished, that love expressed is love multiplied. Diana's death was terrible, but the response to her death taught us how to live better. The charitable legacy has been extraordinary. Research conducted by Cambridge University shows that in the 5 years following Diana's death, charitable giving in Britain increased by over 40%. Organizations she had supported, AIDS research, landmine clearance, homeless shelters, children's hospitals, reported unprecedented growth in both funding and volunteerism. The Diana Award, established to continue her work with young people, has now recognized over 50,000 young changemakers across the globe. But perhaps most significantly, Diana's death and the global response marked a fundamental shift in how the world processes grief and celebrates life. Social media platforms, which barely existed in 1997, now routinely see similar outpourings of collective mourning when beloved figures die. The template established during Diana's tribute week, the spontaneous gathering, the flower tributes, the sharing of personal stories, the transformation of grief into action, has been repeated countless times, from the death of Michael Jackson to the passing of Nelson Mandela, to more recent losses that have touched the global consciousness. Thomas often encounters international visitors who come to the memorial specifically because they remember participating in the 1997 tributes from their own countries. A Japanese businessman once told him about watching the funeral at 3 a.m. in Tokyo, surrounded by hundreds of others in a hotel lobby, all of them crying for a woman they had never met. A grandmother from Brazil described how her local church had held special services for Diana, attended by people who had never shown interest in the British royal family, but who recognized something universal in the princess's appeal. The flowers themselves became the subject of scientific study. Botanists from Kew Gardens cataloged over 3,000 different species among the tributes, representing flora from every continent. Seeds from flowers left during the tribute week were carefully preserved and later used to create memorial gardens in countries around the world. The Diana rose, developed by British horticulturalists using genetic material from flowers left at Kensington Palace, now grows in gardens from California to New Zealand, ensuring that the floral tribute continues to bloom annually. Technology has preserved much of what happened during that extraordinary week. The British Library now houses a complete archive of letters, cards, and written tributes left during the mourning period. Digitized and translated into multiple languages, this collection represents one of the most comprehensive records of public sentiment ever assembled. Researchers study the materials to understand how shared grief can build community, how individual loss can inspire collective action, and how personal stories can create lasting social change. The royal family itself was permanently changed by the events of 1997. Queen Elizabeth II, initially criticized for her restrained response to Diana's death, later acknowledged that the week taught the monarchy important lessons about connecting with public emotion. Subsequent royal events have incorporated elements first seen during Diana's tribute week: greater public access, more informal interaction between royals and citizens, and recognition that royal service must be visibly connected to ordinary people's lives. Prince William and Prince Harry, now adults with families of their own, have made Diana's humanitarian legacy central to their own public roles. The charitable foundation they established in their mother's memory has continued her work in mental health awareness, conservation, and support for vulnerable communities. Their decision to make their mother's engagement ring part of Catherine's wedding jewelry ensured that Diana's memory would be present at future royal celebrations. Thomas often reflects on the personal transformations he witnessed during that week. Eleanor Hughes, the elderly woman who had brought pink roses on the first morning, lived another 15 years after Diana's death. She spent them volunteering at local hospitals, inspired by Diana's example of using whatever privilege and time she had to serve others. Dr. Michael Harrison expanded his HIV clinic into a comprehensive healthcare center that now serves one of Britain's most diverse communities, funded partly by donations that poured in during the tribute week. The stories multiplied across the globe. The young mother from Northern Ireland who had written about finding hope in Diana's peacemaking efforts went on to establish a reconciliation center that has helped hundreds of families heal from the traumas of sectarian conflict. The businessman who had knelt beside a homeless man among the flowers established a foundation providing job training and housing support. The punk rocker with purple hair became a social worker specializing in youth services. Each transformation represented the ripple effect of that single white rose, the way one gesture of love had inspired millions of others. Thomas began keeping track of these stories, understanding that he was witnessing something unprecedented, a death that had generated more life, a loss that had created lasting gain, a moment of grief that had spawned decades of hope. The media coverage of Diana's death had also created new standards for reporting on public figures and private grief. Journalists who had covered the tribute week often described it as career-defining, the moment they understood that their role was not just to report events, but to help society process shared experiences. The combination of traditional broadcast media and emerging internet platforms had created the first truly global conversation, a template that would influence how major events were covered for generations. Educational institutions around the world now study the 1997 response to Diana's death, as a case example in subjects ranging from sociology to marketing to international relations. Business schools examine how the global economy adapted to accommodate collective grief. Psychology departments analyze how shared mourning can strengthen social bonds. Political science courses explore how the outpouring influenced government policies on everything from mental health services to humanitarian aid. As Thomas concludes his regular visit to the memorial, he pauses at the small plaque that marks the approximate location where that first white rose was placed. The inscription, chosen through a global competition, reads simply, "In memory of Diana, Princess of Wales, who showed us that love in action is the most powerful force for change in the world." New flowers appear daily at the memorial, left by visitors who want to connect their personal moments of remembrance with the larger legacy. Thomas has watched children bring flowers for deceased grandparents. Teenagers leave roses after breakups. Adults place bouquets while processing job losses or health scares. The memorial has become a place where personal grief intersects with universal hope, where individual stories become part of a larger narrative about human resilience and compassion. The single white rose, long since composted and returned to the earth, had indeed sparked something extraordinary. Not just a week of unprecedented public mourning, but a permanent shift in how humanity understands its capacity for collective love. Diana's death had been a tragedy, but the response to her death had revealed something beautiful about human nature. Our instinctive understanding that in the face of loss, we must choose to love more deeply, not less. As Thomas walks away from the memorial, he carries with him the satisfaction of having served not just a princess, but a principle. He had been present at a moment when the world chose love over indifference, hope over despair, action over paralysis. The flowers were gone, but their message remained. That every gesture of compassion matters, that individual kindness can inspire global change, and that sometimes it takes the loss of someone extraordinary to remind us how extraordinary we all have the potential to be. The legacy of the rose continues to bloom in gardens around the world, in charitable foundations, in government policies, in changed hearts, and in the countless daily acts of kindness inspired by the memory of a woman who believed that love truly was the most powerful force in the universe. And somewhere in London, on gray September mornings, you can still catch the faintest fragrance of flowers on the wind, reminding anyone willing to notice that love, once expressed, never truly dies.